It's so good to be here. Do we have the laser printer working? And do I need to do this every time? I'm fine doing it. I really am. It's just we've got a lot of slides. So, is it working? We're good? Okay. No, it's not. Okay, but we got the laser. Okay, so we're going to get to know each other. This will be fun. Okay. First off, it's a real honor to be here. I'm from a family of educators. It took all my family of educators to get me through college and medical school and all that kind of stuff. And so I really cherish what you do, and it's been a wonderful week. Ron and his staff have been great. Avi and his program on Tuesday was just wonderful. So it's really good to be here, and let's get going. Here's what I'm here to do is tell you everything we've learned not everything, but all the things in my experience that we've learned medically and how we can apply those things to you folks in the room, and you can apply them to your students. Next. I'm here to talk about medical care and high-performance environments. Next. Really high-performance environments. Next. We got 300 slides, buddy. We're going to go. The unique environments of space, which is weightlessness, which makes you look at things very differently. Next. And I'm here to talk about operational space medicine as best as I can. Next slide. One of the things, I've been there since 1994. I've been training since 1984. If we take care of, we have our shift workers at Mission Control. We take care of folks in the clinic, underwater, and in these beautiful high-performance T-38 jets. Next slide. Which I've really had a lot of fun playing in. That's right there. Next slide. That's also yours truly here. We also get to practice emergency rescue at sea, which we'll need to do here soon. Hopefully not emergency rescue. Next slide. And I had just such a wonderful career working with the shuttle. The shuttle's main design, of course, was to build the International Space Station. Next slide. Which is truly an amazing array of parts and things. Next slide. And truly an international event with 15 countries and 5 agencies. Next slide. And my job, when I got to NASA, was they said, you need to build the emergency medical system for the space station, and you need to prove that we can do all these emergency procedures on humans in space. I went, okay. Next slide. So the only way to do that was the parabolic flight device, the KC-135. Next slide. And of course, things in zero gravity work very differently. Fluids work very differently. Next slide. You can't hang a bottle of IV fluids. You've got to have an air fluid separator and a pressure vessel. Next slide. You have to have your medications pre-packaged or centrifuged. Next slide. You have to teach, you have very capable, some of the smartest people in the world, astronauts, cosmonauts, and you have to teach them in 75 hours to be crew medical officers and how to do emergency medical procedures. And not only in 1G, but next slide, how would you do it in microgravity? And that's where restraint is so important. Next slide. So I took the job of coming up with a porcine model of 12 giant 120-pound pigs to prove that you could do CPR in 0G. Next slide. Where we learned to do our emergency, where we learned to do our emergency cricothyrotomy procedures. Next slide. Where we learned to do chest tubes. Where we learned to do laparoscopic surgery, which we will probably need to do someday on a trip to Moon or Mars. Next slide. So Richard Jennings and Mark Campbell will go down in history as being the first people to do laparoscopic surgery in orbit. Next slide. And will go down in history as the first person to do mouth-to-snout resuscitation on a 120-pound pig. Next slide. And I had a really great time doing it, okay? Of course, there are some perks of flying on the KC-135. A couple weeks after that, next slide. Next slide. You got to play with Opie and Tom Hanks and the gang of Apollo 13. We're doing 0G badminton. Next slide. And you also get to see your work come to fruition. And this is actually Shane Kimbrough doing CPR last year on the, and this is our emergency medical system on the space station. We worry about a decompression sickness hit or an electrocution, and we have to do CPR just briefly until we can get the paddles on and convert them from a dysrhythmia. Next slide. So this $120 billion spacecraft, a truly amazing piece of work. Next slide. We now get to it since 2011 by a Soyuz. Next slide. So every 2 to 4 months, we're launching from a Soyuz. Next slide. This was the day before launch of the last mission that I supported, and this is the launch the next day. Next slide, the weather. So things can kind of change in Kazakhstan. Next slide. And so you march your crew out in these really cool Gumby outfits. Next slide. Put them on the craft. Next slide. And they launch. Next slide. And they spend 48 hours or 6 hours on the Soyuz before they dock with, next slide, with the International Space Station. And that's where they live for 6 months. And you're going to hear from someone later who has lived there for quite a long time, and you've, of course, heard from Garrett. Next slide. And it's truly, from what they've told me, really pretty amazing. Next slide. And this is Dr. Peggy Whitson. And so this is my Women in Space. I'm just going to lead by the example that I was her crew surgeon on her second mission. Peggy was the first female commander of the International Space Station. She was the first head of the Astronaut Corps, female head of the Astronaut Corps. Next slide. And she also holds the record for the most cumulative days in space. Truly amazing individual. Next slide. So Peggy gets to work hard on all our exercise devices. Next slide. This is Peggy working out on the advanced resistive exercise device. Next slide. This is because she's got to be strong, because the most dangerous thing we do and the thing that takes the most is to go out and do that spacewalk. Next slide. They're not just hanging out. They're working really hard. Next slide. Next slide. And of course, she's also doing medical experiments. One of the other areas that we've excelled at is an ultrasound. So that's an ultrasound machine right there. And Peggy is actually checking, what do you think? Next slide. Her kidneys. Because when she's losing 1% of her calcium stores a month, fortunately she's not, because she exercised so hard. But when you're losing that kind of calcium loss, which is what we on the ground lose in a year, and when you lose that in a month, that calcium goes to your kidneys, and we worry about forming kidney stones. Next slide. We're also, where's most of the fluid right now in my body? A lot of it's in my feet. And then when you go to space, it goes to your head. So we're concerned about fluid shifts in the body, and this is a way to measure her carotid thickness. Next slide. There's also a sleep station, and of course, sleep is an interesting thing, and I'll talk about that at the end, because you're getting a sunrise and sunset every 45 minutes. Next slide. You're also getting our OSHA, our international standard of radiation, you're getting 10 times that amount. Okay, so radiation is used. Next slide. You're also getting 10 times the carbon dioxide that you would be allowed to have in this room. Next slide. You're also losing 10 times your bone if you're not exercising and doing the proper countermeasures. Next slide. So every part of the body, the vestibular system, the blood, the weight-bearing muscles, fluid distribution, the kidneys, everything is affected. Next slide. And then this is John Clark, who's sitting right there, who's a flight surgeon with us. We started, we've been flying 6 people now for over a decade. And we started noticing, we do a private medical conference every week with the crew. We do private site conferences every 2 weeks. And we started noticing some changes in about 20 to 30% of our crews that were significant. Next slide. We started to notice that there were some interesting visual changes. And what's happened is the back of the eyeball, the optic disc, has become inflamed and flattens out. And this has become a syndrome. We first thought it was an intracranial hypertension problem. We're just not sure yet. We're still trying to figure it all out. Next slide. And you can see the difference in the back of the retina pre-flight and post-flight in some of our crew members. Next slide. And you can understand why. Again, that fluid shift, that puffiness. So you don't drain your brain as well. And it may be that the back of the eyeball is where that interface, that venous and arterial interface have a backup. Next slide. And again, next slide. Next. 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 So you can see, next. So you can essentially see that in zero gravity, it's like living at almost a small head down tilt. So you're not going to drain your brain as well as I am right now. Next slide. So the possibilities are, again, the fluid shift, the fact that you're breathing so much carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a potent cerebrovasodilator, increases your arterial flow in your brain. We're exercising, so what are you doing there? You're straining. There are some genetic factors. There are some venous occlusion factors with males, gender differences in that males have larger sternocleidomastoids, and therefore the carotid and that mastoid muscle pushing on the jugular may impede further outflow. Also, women get atherosclerotic changes much later in life than males, and that may also be a factor in why we're not seeing this. We also thought that for a while there that, and we still do, that the stress and not sleeping is not a good thing too. Next slide. So, Peggy's had a great time on station. She's broken all sorts of records, done spacewalks, and now she's eventually got to say bye and she's got to come home. Next slide. So she gets in the Soyuz and she comes home. Next slide. Next slide. Well, that's a really, next slide. That's a really nice, beautiful landing out in the fields of cosmic. But no, it's Peggy. Next slide. So she had to land and set the field on fire and come in ballistically. Next slide. Next slide. And it was a fun time. There's yours truly. And this guy's having a seizure. The crew's fine, but this guy's having a seizure. So it was a fun day in Kazakhstan. Next slide. And she did well. It was tough, but she did well. Next slide. And next day she's actually nope, go back. She's on an isokinetic machine testing her muscle strength of her lower extremities. This device gives you an objective measure of muscle strength throughout about 85% of your body musculature. Next slide. And that's how we tell how she's getting better. So this person is not ill or injured on landing. This person is deconditioned. And some people do really well, some people don't. Next slide. That's why we feel like we're needed at landing. So again, all the systems of the body are affected in zero gravity, and especially during the transitions from 1 to 0 gravity. Next slide. And especially radiation. In fact, that right now is, it's not a showstopper, but it's a really big dilemma for us, and we need to go research that. Next slide. Because 6 months to the planet, 18 months on Mars, and 6 months back, we're gonna blow our radiation standards out. Next. And that's because we've got these things called solar flares. Next. And the Earth, we're traveling 1,000 miles an hour right now, and we've got an iron core. Next slide. So we basically have a force field. Next slide. It's called the Van Allen belts that protect us from these high-energy galactic cosmic rays and also these solar flares. These only go out 4,000 miles, and really when you get above 400 miles, you start to get much more radiation. Next slide. And that's why on the moon, you don't have a radiation protection. And when we go there, we're going to take solar flare hits, and we need to go there and experience that and learn how to shield. Next slide. Because Apollo 14 missed a major solar flare by 2 weeks. And that's why I'm so excited about your vehicle going to the moon and us putting more vehicles on the moon to be able to monitor what sort of radiation changes we have. Next slide. Yay. And we know we're going to Mars, right? Because next slide. They're taking pictures of us. You know, that's us, the Earth. Next slide. And we found water on Mars. I'm sorry, I'll sink very low to get a laugh. Next slide. And the radiation, as I told you, is much worse. Next slide. Okay, so I've told you about the space environment. I told you how kind of hostile it is and how unique it is. And how beautiful it is, too, from what I've understood. And I'm now going to talk to you, instead about the aerospace part, I want to talk to you about preventive, because I'm also board certified in preventive medicine. That's what we're trying to do. We take very healthy people, and we put them in really funky, unique environments. Next slide. And that's what I'm here to talk about. how our genetics, our screening, what we do with our astronauts, what we've learned from that, and how we can prevent disease so that they can live productive and great lives, and I would tell you long lives. Next slide. Because we know how to select people who are really fit and really good shape. Next slide. And put them in uniquely crazy environments on a dune buggy. Next slide. We know how to select 6 amazingly, physically brilliant astronauts who are female, and we know, and put them, next slide, put them in amazingly interesting environments on the Mir space station. This is Shannon Lucid, who's the first one on the Mir for our team. Next slide. And of course, Peggy Whitson, who holds the record for the most time in space. Next slide for us. These are our medical standards that I've been basically worked with and in charge of from NASA, and also with the multilateral partners for quite a while. And we need these standards because, unfortunately, like everybody else, astronauts get sick. Next slide. So these are things, these didn't happen in orbit, although a couple of them did, but these are all the maladies that have happened to astronauts, that happen to all of us sitting out here, that we've had to fix and return to flight. Next slide. Some of note, 14 kidney stones, 5 prostate cancers. We've had to radio frequency ablate 5 atrial fibs. We've had 2 brain tumors that we've removed, that we've found. We've had knee replacements. We've had over 22 shoulder surgeries because that EVA suit is one of the most user-unfriendly things in the world. And we've had 12 asymptomatic coronary disease folks. Now, why would we find people with coronary disease? Well, that's because everybody in this room, most likely, has a little bit of coronary disease. You start forming coronary disease at the age of 9, depending, hopefully later. At the age of 30 in our country, in the US, about half the males and females have 30% lesions, okay? And I'll show you how you can reverse that and fix that, okay? Next slide. Because our job is to keep you flying. Unfortunately, next slide, John Glenn and the rest of the the original Mercury 7 none of them are with us right now. They've passed. Next slide. And 2 of these folks are not with us. Judy Resnick, of course, died in Challenger, and Sally Ride died of pancreatic cancer. Next slide. So the other thing we're going to look at is we're studying, when you put people up in space, you're putting them in an accelerated aging process. And the things that we learn from that are some of the things I want to emphasize. Next slide. I'm also going to end the talk on what do we know about centenarians. There's several centers around the world, and all they do is study folks that live past the age of 100 or 110. And I'll end the talk on that. Next slide. So it's all about mitigating risk through medical screening, and I'm going to talk about diet, exercise, fatigue, stress management, and medical treatment. Next slide. And I'm going to use myself as an example because I'm a floating disaster as far as genetics and cardiovascular disease and all that kind of stuff, and I can share with you my medical information. Next slide. So again, knowing your strengths and weaknesses, your genes, knowing your environment, what you eat and breathe, your fitness, your musculoskeletal strength, your psychological well-being. Next slide. Next. So, genetics. It all comes down to family history. We've all got a crazy Uncle Louie who's always going the wrong way, okay? But it's knowing your strengths and weaknesses. Next slide. And a very simplistic term is about 70%, our genes are about 20 to 30% of our makeup. It's basically what we expose those genes to and how they react, okay? And that's the environment, and that's what I want to talk about. Next slide. So what is a gene? A gene basically, DNA turns on RNA to go make a protein that goes and does something. Genomics is a set of genes that react to an environmental stressor and goes and takes care of it, okay? And there are genes, I have some genes that are strengths, very few, and others that are not, like the dyslexic gene, the ApoE4 gene, the lipo-a gene, that aren't good. So that's why I'm on top of this stuff. Next slide. So this is a phenotype of Michael Phelps, okay, at a very early stage, okay? So this is a phenotype. In other words, there's genetics, and then there's what you end up looking like. And we all know that Michael Phelps was a very fast swimmer. Obviously, he's one of the great gold medalists. But we also, next slide, we know that Michael Phelps, when he smoked too much pot and he didn't work out, he couldn't find the golden prize. Okay, next slide. But he corrected those factors. Next slide, and was able to win his 23rd Olympic gold medal. Next slide. So, when you raise your 2 kids in Houston, Texas, and then one of them decides to go to CU Boulder and study aerospace engineer in Boulder, Colorado, next slide, that changes that individual, okay? Their phenotype changes a little. Next slide. And when you take twins like these, next slide, and they grow up to be astronauts like these, and you take those folks, next slide, and you put them in orbit and you compare the different changes, as Scott talked about the other day, his DNA changed. His DNA changed in that his messenger RNA, his RNA that went and made protein, because they were experiencing different environments changed. Next slide. And we're working with some of the top folks in the industry. Next slide. And, you know, Kate Rubins is the first person to actually sequence somebody in orbit. We have a sequencer on the space station. Next slide. So again, we're trying to get to personalized genomic medicine, individualized care. Next slide. Dive. No. And so we can get the right medicine and the right prescription and the right preventive measure for the right person. Next slide. Again, it's what we eat and breathe. It's how physically fit and strong we are. I want to emphasize that. And psychological well-being. Next slide. And as far as the stars aligning for what psychological well-being means to me, and we've got a former NASA psychiatrist in here, John Marcellus, and he can answer those questions if we have them. For me, my 5th vital sign, next slide, is how well are you sleeping? Next slide. If you're sleeping well, then psychologically things are probably going pretty well. Next slide. So how can this incredible closed-loop system, this environmental system, how can we use it to tell us about those factors? Next slide. Well, let's take it. Let's go one at a time. What we breathe and eat, and then I'll talk about exercise and strength, psychological well-being, and then I'll close. Next slide. Okay, well, in our country, not in your country, but in our country in the US of A, preventable causes of death, smoking is the number 1. Obesity is number 2. Alcohol, drug abuse. And that's changed. It's gotten worse with the opioid addiction problem. In our country, 130 people a day die of opioid or drug or suicide. Next slide. That's 85% of our annual health care expenditures, okay? We're broken. It's $10,000 a person. It's 20% of our gross domestic product. So I'm going to talk about these 2 things because they really impact us. Next slide. So if you're on the International Space Station and you don't clean the filters because they had an emergency and they lost 3 of their, they didn't lose them, they had to go home and they had to get behind. Remember, where's dirt right now? Most of the dirt in this building is on the floor or it's being filtered. Well, in orbit, it's floating. So it got so bad that when they were eating their afternoon meal, they would actually have a sore throat on Dan's mission. Next slide. So you've got to clean the filters, okay? Next slide. Not to mention, it's a closed-loop system. This is one of the coolest buildings I've ever been in, and everything is filtered. But if you took this building and you turned off the ventilation system and you closed all the doors and sealed up all the vents, I guarantee you about 30 minutes to an hour from now, our IQs would be about 5 points lower. Next slide. And that's been proven at the Harvard School of Public Health. They did exactly that. And they looked at IQ, and it was much lower, and irritability. And Garrett will tell you when you're on the space shuttle and the LiO canister doesn't get changed out correctly, it wasn't his fault. Then the CO2 goes way up. People's personality changes, their vision changes, and that's why we think it's contributing. Next slide. Next slide. And that's why it's been so important. It costs money, energy, power to scrub the carbon dioxide that we're all making. We're the carbon dioxide producers. And we've fought and fought and fought and refurnished and gotten those carbon dioxide levels lower and lower and lower. And our symptomatology is getting much, much less. Next slide. Okay, let's talk about what we want to eat. Okay, great food here, by the way. Everybody gets it. Next slide. Butter's fine too. Okay, just don't eat a ton of it. Next slide. Okay, this is the triple coronary bypass burger. Next slide. This is at the Vortex with my son. You have to be 21 to get in this thing to eat the burger. Next slide. So it's 3 burger patties, 3 fried eggs, 14 slices of American cheese, 10 slices of bacon, all packed between 2 grilled cheese sandwiches with a little cheesy goo on top. It's only $25, but it feeds a family of 5 for 2 weeks. Next slide. So basically, we eat too much. We also cook our meat too much. Next slide. Smoked beef in Texas. We also put too many chemicals in our meat. We have really fast horses in Houston, by the way. Next slide. It's a chemical plant. Next slide. And that's true. They've done the studies. It's not necessarily the meat that's bad for you, although they are high in fat calories and trans fats, but it's basically the processed meats that are imparting probably a carcinogenic risk and also an inflammatory risk to your blood vessels. Next slide. It's also about refined sugar, too much sugar. Next slide. Next slide. In our diet, we have 22 teaspoons of, can you imagine sitting down and eating 22 teaspoons of sugar? Not to mention, if you probably could do it if you had all the salt with it. And that's what we get in our country. Next slide. And that's why being obese and overweight is accounting for about 40% of our cancers. Next slide. So these are all the cancers, adeno, kidney, uterus, ovaries, colon, pancreas, that are associated with obesity. Next slide. And unfortunately, the good news is that not associated with obesity, we're going down in our country. The ones associated with obesity, except for colon rectal, because we've gotten so good at screening that, are going up in our country, and that's paralleling the obesity. Next slide. So don't let that sugar clog your brain up, but some sugar is good. I'm okay with that. Next slide. This was a huge study that came out the other year from Journal of American Medical Association, look at association of dietary factors and mortality. Next slide. And the take-home message, which you already know, is that all our cardiometabolic deaths are related to high sodium, low nuts, low seeds, high processed meats, low seafood, omega-3s, low vegetables, low fruits, and high sugar-packed beverages. Next slide. And that's why meals are so important up in orbit to get the right nutrition to counteract all those things that are injuring those folks as far as radiation and things. It's also a place that's psychologically very important. I want to put Dex in there. Next slide. And if you want to take a picture of this slide, this is all you need for nutrition. This sums it up. If you follow these rules, you will get all your nutrients from your meal, except in orbit, we need one supplement, and that's vitamin D, because you can't go out and stroll outside and get a little ultraviolet radiation and convert your vitamin D. Next slide. Also, the other thing that changes in orbit from the genetics with the Kelly brothers was the gut biome, and that's very important, and that's a whole other area that I could give a whole talk on, but I'm not. Next slide, because I've got just 10 minutes left. And if I'd had a clicker, it might have been fast. No. Okay. So finally, not finally, on this, I'm going to show you this. Next slide. The other thing is astronaut mortality. This is an old slide, but again, accidents, as we all know too well. Next slide. Let's look at this. All right. This is a mortality curve. This curve is a male. The females are actually out here. You outlive us, depending on the country, anywhere from 12 to 2 years. And so this is a curve. And so what does that mean? That means at age 30, everyone's pretty much alive. At age 80, if you're a normal male, okay, in the US of A, you've got a 40% chance of being alive. Okay? Now, these two lines carry equal weight. One is that you've not smoked, not significantly. It's 20 20 pack year, so a pack a year for 20 years is considered significant. Okay? So these two lines, there are two lines here, and the other is that you're a normal weight. Now when you put those two together, you move the slide here. So you move the curve here, which means if you didn't smoke and you're a normal weight, at the age of 80, you now have an 80% chance. You just doubled your chance of making it to 80, okay? So besides teaching, you know, Hebrew and English and math and science, we need to be teaching physical education, and that's the other message we've got in diet and things. Well, how are the astronauts doing? Well, they're not doing well here until we get out here. Why? Next slide. Well, because of the reason we're all here. Next slide. Because we've lost a lot of folks in obtaining the dream of building this space station. Next slide. So when you take out the tragedies, then our astronauts are doing quite well, and they're out here in the 90s. And this has sort of been my emphasis in the last 4 or 5 years, is to try to develop a program for looking at folks who are in their 80s and 90s and 70s. Next slide. Bottom line is fresh fruits. Next slide. Fresh vegetables. We're even growing lettuce on the space station. Next slide. And eat your veggies. Next slide. And you will live long and prosper. Okay. Next slide. All right, let's talk about exercise, strength, and physical fitness. Next slide. You got to be strong to be able to do this. Next slide. All right, let's look at this. These are death rates for females. These are death rates for males. Well, males have more death rates. Why is that? Next slide. Because males tend to do, hey, I wonder what happens if you do this. Like, here's a 32-year-old and goes, you know, I got this bulletproof vest. It's like 30 years old. I wonder if it still works. Yeah, no, it doesn't. Okay, next slide. That could be a testosterone brain. I don't know. So anyway, what this means is nobody exercised, okay? No exercise. You're a couch potato. So those are your death rates. This is just walking 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week. This is doubling that, okay? So that's what a difference it makes. Next slide. And we know that also makes a difference in cancer rates, okay? Next slide. It makes a difference in how well we live in our older years. So you've got to stay active. You've got to stay fit. Next slide. And here's a slide for folks who are obese or who are overweight. You can be overweight and still be fit. You can still get out there and walk and run around. And your death rate is very similar. Obese is here, normal weight's here. It's very similar to a normal weight person. So just go out there and walk and walk and walk, and then eventually change your diet so that you get those calories off. And here's a normal individual who's unfit. Okay, that's cool. That's good. How did you know that? Okay. Then there's Mike Evans, who put this together. What medicine, next slide, just keep clicking, gives lower arthritis, 50% reduction in diabetes, menopausal, keep going. Anxiety, depression, Harvard alumni, 20% death rate, slow down. What medicine would do all that? Next slide. The pharma, Teva would pay millions for it. Next slide. It's exercise, okay? Next slide. That's why exercise is so important for us. We have 2 hours, 2.5 hours that we dedicated up in space because we're floating the rest of the time. Next slide. In fact, go back. I think that's your next speaker over here coming up who's exercising on the resistive. Next slide. And there's Mike Barrett on the advanced resistive exercise device. Next slide. Next slide. And so this study basically tells us, here's a problem. We were losing all this calcium, we were losing all this bone. Here on MIR, we were losing about 8%, some as low as 20%, okay? And then we had the resistive exercise device, then the advanced resistive exercise device, and then the Japanese flew the bisphosphonates. And so with bisphosphonates and all these other countermeasures, we've got folks coming back with more bone than they left. We've got some people coming back back when with more bone. So next slide. We kind of fixed this problem. That's kind of cool. Next slide. And even if you land with low bone, below what it should be, in about a year or 2 years, if you work hard, you can get that bone back. We're not sure if it's as much trabecular bone as it is cortical bone, but that's another discussion. Next slide. And then this slide came out in 2008, showed, they basically was out of the Cooper Clinic in Dallas. They followed 9,000 people for 19 years, and they did an exercise stress test, and they did a strength test. And they followed the folks, and the strength test was just as good as predicting all forms of mortality, whether it was cancer, whether it was heart disease, or whether it was accidents. So strength is a good indicator of how you're doing in life. Next slide. And since we've got isokinetic information on our astronauts since 1985 on every selection individual, okay, we can go back and look at this data. Next slide. I did a study with some folks at UTMB where we actually looked at data not on our astronauts but on baggage handlers. They actually used this to screen heavy labor workers. And so this top curve are people who are really strong, bottom curve people who are really weak, and it's about a 3-fold increase in death rates. Next slide. Let's look at twin studies. It's only 10 people, but twins who are really strong and the other twin wasn't. Next slide. What did they find? Well, one of the twins could whip the other twin's butt. But besides that, it was also that their metabolic rates were better, their glucose metabolism was better, and part of their brain was bigger. Okay? So where there is blood, where there is muscle, where there is bone, and there is more brain. Next slide. That was a small study. The Swedes did a very large study looking at kids, 1.1 million male adolescents, 16 to 19. They followed them for 24 years. 26,000 of them died. Those that had high muscle strength with knee extension and hand grip had a 20 to 30% lower risk of premature death from cardiovascular disease and suicide. Okay? So you guys do this. I know you have gym. We got rid of mandatory gym, and this is what we're using to try to get mandatory gym back in our schoolrooms. Next slide. Psychological well-being. We're going to talk about sleep. Got about 5-10 more minutes. We okay? 3 minutes? Now, if I'd had a clicker, I'd be on time. All right? 3 minutes? 4 minutes? Okay. Go. Go. Sleep. Go. Go. Next. You need it. Next. You need it. You know you've made it when you made the front cover of Sleep Review magazine. Next slide. Bottom line, not only is your memory better when you sleep, your brain is actually thinking. You've actually, you know the material better. You've actually understood it. Next slide. And the other thing is that when you sleep, you drain your brain. You clean your brain. You get rid of those amyloid and tau byproducts that give you Alzheimer's. That's why sleep is so important. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. We all are jet lagged. You know, and that's what we do with our astronauts when they're training. They travel and they're not just kind of hanging out. Next slide. You know, they're doing stuff. Next slide. Next slide. And it was so bad, this was basically our sleep hygiene kit, which is still very important today. Next slide. Next slide. In fact, we use bright lights to shift folks. Next slide. Light inhibits melatonin. Next slide. Never mind. Next slide. Next slide. So this is this curve. Next slide. So that's this. Next. So that is this. So this bright blue, these are the most powerful suppressors of melatonin, blue and yellow light, those frequencies. This is what we're experiencing, much less light than this. This is what you get when you go outside. Next slide. So this can be used to your advantage. Next slide. You can carry with LEDs, you can carry the sun in a box, okay? Which we do with our computer. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. All right, so here's your normal melatonin rate, okay, from blood samples. And here's when you turn on a light and look at what happens to your melatonin. That's why bright lights, you want to avoid bright lights before going to bed. Next slide. And you can use that, the timing of light and melatonin, to help shift people. Next slide. Much more efficiently. Next slide. And that's what we've been doing for over about 15 years with our astronauts as they fly around. Next slide. And we've done it for our athletes. Next slide. And we've done it for our pro sports teams as they go play Monday Night Football against the New Orleans Saints. and they did pretty well. Next slide. We're doing it for our flight controllers. Next slide. What I got, 3 minutes now? 3? Okay, next slide. Shift workers, 5 to 7 hours left sleep all the time. All these problems with shift workers. Next slide. And we did a study at NASA where we used light and exercise and increased their alertness, increased their well-being. Next slide. And next slide. And we're spinning that off. Next slide to the general pop. Here's a cool thing. The lights were burning out on station, and Kate brought up the lights, and these are the lights. You can have tunable lights now, okay? And you can buy them at the store, depending on the Kelvin. Over 5K is, the cool lights have a lot of blue. Next slide. And so what we did, next slide, we convinced NASA, instead of just putting this light up there, that we put a tunable light, next slide, which we did, for this during the day, next slide, this at night. I mean, this for waking up and shifting. Next, I'm going to just do this, okay? And then without blue and green to go to sleep. Next. And that's what we've got on orbit. Next. They love it. Next. 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 They love it. Next. The point is, if you go to the cupola and you get a big bolt of light and you see this, Scott Kelly will tell you and others, you're not going to go to bed for an hour or two. Next slide. And that's why you got to tell the youngsters to get off their computer, go to bed with hard covers with reading material. Next slide. Because we're spending 7.5 hours on media. Next slide. Next slide. And you can downlux, it's free. F.lux gives you a screensaver. It takes the blue out. Next slide. And you can buy different lights that will give you performance highs or lows for pre-sleep. Next. Next. We're doing it in hospitals. Next. Next. And you need this. This is my sister, who is a school teacher, and this is the only way she could sleep. And we're working with Thomas Jefferson and other universities to try to implement. Noise is huge in hospital. Anybody's been in a hospital is the worst place to try to sleep. Okay, next. And we're going to need it because if we go to Mars, Mars is 38 minutes later every day. It's a later day, the Martian day. So you have to stay up 38 minutes later. And we did this study on the flight controllers that did the Mars rover and moved their circadian. Next. Okay, final. One of my top outcomes, I got to show you this. This is the most important thing to see all day, and then I'll get out of here. Next slide. And it's only like 20 slides left, more. You've got a single cell lining of this artery, okay? It's called the endothelial cell lining. These are our blood vessels. This is the most important thing in your body besides your neurons. Next slide. This is New England Journal. What happens is LDL, too much or too little or too small, get under here, you have an inflammatory process, and you make a goo. Next slide. And that's next slide. And that's what causes you to have a heart attack, okay? And you rupture it. Next slide. It kills 650,000 people, heart disease, in our country a year. 650,000. Okay, so again, LDL is not supposed to be under here. It gets under here, it forms a plaque, and then you rupture. You will not rupture a plaque if you're physically fit, okay? Unless you had a kinked artery or something. Next slide. The good news is, next slide, you can reverse all this with these chemicals, with exercise, with flossing your teeth, okay? With sleep and stress reduction, and with medications. Next slide. So you can actually do this, and we've done this in astronauts, and we've proven it at Cleveland Clinic and other places. We actually reversed 3-vessel disease in an astronaut and flew them on the International Space Station, and they did fine. You just have to get your numbers right and fix this wall. Next slide. Next slide. So again, we used to squirt dye. Next slide. And then I'll show you this. You'll be interested in this. So we used to think it was like gook, sludge in the ice machine. Next slide. But then somebody developed an intracoronary ultrasound device. So this is an ultrasound probe that you could put in a coronary artery. Next slide. And so therefore, you could actually look at the dimensions of the coronary. Okay, next slide. So here's a normal coronary, a normal intimal medial thickness, and here is a bunch of goo. Here's a lesion, okay? Next slide. Next. So instead of this, go ahead. This is what's going on. Think of it as belly fat around your artery. Okay, next slide. So here's a completely normal coronary artery by angiogram, except there's this huge lesion sitting here. Okay, next slide. Here's a completely normal coronary, except there's a huge lesion, and here is a 30% lesion, and that's because it got so critically big. Next slide. And also because there was probably calcium here that lit it up. Next slide. And so it makes calcium. Next slide. You have to go? Okay, just 2 more slides. Next slide. 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 I could have done this in 30. You can reverse this. You can reverse this. I did it in my neck. This is my neck. You can reverse this with stuff. Next slide. Next. 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 So, centenarians, and we'll close. Next. What do centenarians have in common? Nobody's obese, nobody smoked, and they can handle stress. Women who had kids at a later age actually ended up living much longer. Next slide. So the point is, 15% of people make it to 100 and they don't have any medical problems. So therefore, the older you get, the sicker you get. It's much more, the older you get, the healthier you've been. Next slide. Next slide. Next. And we've got 30 astronauts in their 80s. Next slide. We need your help. Thank you so much, your educators. I had some other fun stuff, but next slide. Next. 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 Oh, next. Next. Avoid the alligator. Next. Spend time with your family. Stop. And this is our family. We're all family, okay? And I want to thank the Ramon family, the Ramon institutions. I want to thank everybody here, all the educators, for bringing us together. I'm sorry this ran long. I apologize. And I love you guys, and thank you.